Okay, so hi everybody, my name's Jess and welcome to this York St John University webinar. Thanks on behalf of all of the team here for joining us to learn more about youth work and votes at 16 today. So the webinar is going to focus on the current policy debate about the implementation of votes at 16 and how to support young people to vote. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr Carole Pugh from York St John, who will be presenting her research findings and recommendations. And Carole is joined by Andy Mycock from the University of Leeds and Charlie Buscher from the Youth Work Unit, Yorkshire and Humber. So thanks to Andy and Charlie for joining us as Q&A panelists, and we look forward to hearing your responses to Carole's presentation. I would also like to welcome Chris Redford from Studio Noodle, and Chris is going to be live drawing the webinar to help us capture all the discussion and debate. And we will have a formal Q&A at the end of the presentation and the responses. But if you think of any questions whilst the presentations are going, then please do feel free to add those questions in the question and answer function that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. So, as well as being a senior lecturer in children, young people and education here at York St John Uni, Carole is a qualified youth worker with over 25 years experience working with young people in statutory and voluntary sector roles. Carole is also chair of the York Youth Partnership and convener of the Raise York Family Hub Research Network. So Carole is really well placed to lead our discussions today in this crucial policy area. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Carole for her presentation.
So the webinar is going to outline the findings from my research about the role that youth work plays in supporting young people's political socialisation. And it's going to consider how these findings can be drawn on to identify approaches that can support young people to engage as Votes at 16 is rolled out. So firstly, I want to say a little bit about the term political socialisation and why I'm using that term rather than political education. So by political socialisation, I mean the interaction between the exposure to a range of ideas and experiences and young people's exertion of their own individual agency that enables them to develop their own political ideas and to make decisions about how and if they participate in political activity. So political education tends to focus on the information and experiences that are presented to young people, assuming more of a top-down approach that the young people will absorb the ideas that are presented to them. Political socialisation recognises that young people draw on a wide range of sources and experiences, including the citizenship education that they may receive, but alongside a range of other influences. So the conversations they have with adults around them, their experiences, and indeed the information they're getting from social media. And that young people themselves play an active part in constructing their own political identities. So moving on to consider the role of youth work. So we know that youth work plays a significant role in young people's political socialisation. There are around 4.4 million young people that regularly engage in youth work in the UK, and many of these come from under-resourced, from disadvantaged areas. Those young people are often less likely to vote, and they're often more likely to disengage from formal citizenship education. Findings from the United States looking at informal youth work provision indicate the role that informal conversations with other young people and with adults play in young people's political socialisation as well. The Votes at 16 campaign itself has its roots in good youth work. So the UK Youth Parliament was one of the organisations that drove the Votes at 16 campaign forwards, and youth work shaped the lowering of the voting age in Scotland and in Wales. However, a lot of the policy debates about political socialisation and citizenship education predominantly focus on the role of formal education in schools, so formal citizenship education. So this is where my research comes in. So my research addresses the gap in knowledge about the role of youth work in supporting young people's political socialisation. The research draws on focus groups with young people and with youth workers. And I also went and I did participant observation of over 50 different youth work sessions at 4 projects in the northern city. You can see a little bit more detail about the timings of the research on the slide. The projects that I did the research at were drawn from a wide range of settings. There was voluntary sector, there was some commissioned youth work, there was some local authority provision, and there were open access universal youth work, as well as some more targeted youth voice projects. So firstly, the research explored the dimensions that young people felt framed their understanding of political citizenship. And there were 6 dimensions that identified. All of these dimensions were important to young people. So the first dimension is around formal politics. So this involved understanding of political institutions and systems, so things like voting, but it also involved understanding of political parties, um, engagement with individual politicians, as well as political values. The second dimension that was really important to young people was opportunities to get involved. And that was through formal volunteering as well as informal volunteering, but also opportunities to engage and to participate fully within their communities. Issues were another area that was really important to young people, and young people discussed a wide variety of things that they felt were important. Some of those were things that impacted directly on their lives, so that might be the education system, mental health provision, housing or poverty. Some of those issues were much more national or global in their reach. And one of the areas that also informed that was discussions around national and legal citizenship. Another dimension that was really important in terms of shaping young people's understandings of political citizenship was around protest and campaigns. And then the final dimension that we identified was around rights, respect, and responsibility. So young people wanted to know about their rights, but they also wanted opportunities to be able to enact them. And they said it was really important to have opportunities where they could take responsibility and feel like they were respected by the wider community. So these dimensions reflect other research that's looked at the broader repertoires of political participation. So that's the work of Sarah Picard, and understandings around kind of lived citizenship that were identified by Kaleo et al. So I used these dimensions then to go and examine the extent to which youth work was able to address them. And youth work provided many opportunities to address some of these dimensions. So young people saw youth workers giving them access to lots of opportunities to be able to get involved, to engage with their communities and to volunteer. And that it provided lots of informal experiences of democratic processes. So this involved sort of finding ways to make their voices heard, contributing to the development and delivery that was happening within their youth projects, and also getting more engaged in their local communities. These opportunities in turn helped develop young people's knowledge and experiences of their rights, of feeling respected, and of taking responsibility. And young people really highlighted the importance of these experiences as it enabled them to feel like they were full citizens, which is vital for newly enfranchised 16 to 17-year-old voters. Finally, there were some projects that were able to develop young people's knowledge and experiences of formal political processes. These tended to be the youth voice projects more than the open access ones. And those projects were able to provide opportunities for young people to meet politicians, often local politicians, and local decision makers, and to take part in some more formal voting structures, so perhaps proposing campaigns and then voting on them. So this provides evidence of the significant role that youth work already plays in supporting young people's political socialisation. However, while there were some dimensions that youth work fully addressed, so opportunities around getting involved and addressing rights and respect and responsibility, there were other areas that youth work struggled to engage more with. And if we look at that list, as you move further down it, you can see the more contentious political topics. Those were the areas where youth workers were more reluctant to enter into those spaces. So in terms of formal politics, they would talk about structures and institutions, but they were much more cautious about discussing particular politicians, political parties, looking critically at any particular policies or discussions around political values. In terms of issues, youth workers would discuss how individual young people were impacted by issues and were good at supporting them to try and address them through accessing services, but they were much more reluctant to discuss how political policies or party positions related to those issues and to young people's experiences. And it was really clear from the research that youth workers did not feel that they should discuss protest with young people. So if you have a look at the quote that's on the screen there, you can see the first youth worker says there's a limit on how much we can actually support them with political development. We can support them to be good citizens, to understand different things, to have a voice, to get involved, to partake in democracy. And then the second youth worker says, if they want to have a political debate, we wouldn't see that as part of what we do. So as you can see from this quote, this restricts the dimensions of political citizenship that are covered and limits young people's political socialisation. One of the key barriers that restricted youth workers' ability to address political issues was a lack of a clear remit to do this. So if we look at the top quote there, there's a youth worker saying, I don't know where I've got this, but we shouldn't really educate young people about politics. That was a view that was regularly expressed by youth workers. They were not clear that politics was a topic that they should be discussing with young people. However, it was also clear that both young people and youth workers felt that discussing these areas would be beneficial and could help better equip young people for political citizenship. So if we look at the second quote there from a young person, I do definitely think there needs to be room to talk about party politics in its entirety. Young people wanted space to be able to have these discussions. And then from a youth worker at the bottom, maybe we should bring it up and be like, if you could vote, who would you vote for? Actually start these conversations and start them thinking now before they get to voting. And they are like, I wish I'd learned this. So it was clear that both young people and youth workers felt that restricting conversations about political issues impeded youth work's capacity to support political socialisation. It was also apparent that many youth workers felt that they lacked knowledge to facilitate political citizenship, as illustrated in this quote. So another youth worker saying, I guess I've always thought I don't know enough about politics to feel comfortable educating them, whereas I understand about sexual health and we understand about racism or we understand about culture. So while youth workers are really well equipped to have a lot of conversations about sensitive issues, they were not confident to talk about politics. Political education is not an area that is well covered in youth work training and education, and this lack of knowledge leads to a reluctance for youth workers to develop those conversations around political topics. This isn't an issue that only applies to youth work. Indeed, it reflects the implementation gap that's been found in formal citizenship educations in schools, and it also mirrors the limited training and resources that restrict school teachers' capacity to effectively deliver the citizenship curriculum. Another key limitation in youth work practice identified in this research was youth work's reluctance to have conversations with young people about protest. It was clear that some young people involved in the research had participated in protest. However, there was only one instance in all of the observed session where protest was mentioned, and that is in the quote above. So that wasn't talked about with young people. As we packed up, one youth worker talked about a protest that young people had done against the Rwanda immigration scheme. They said it would have been hard to support them from within their paid role. So this indicates that youth workers were aware of young people's participation in protests, but they felt they were not able to engage around this issue. And this is despite protest increasingly being seen by young people as a relevant, accessible, and effective form of political citizenship, as the second quote illustrates. So this young person was talking about their engagement with the school strikes and said, it's one of the biggest ways that I got into proper politics. So I think it's special to a lot of young people, especially young people, because it's the only way they could get involved in politics. So, however, there's no evidence that restricting discussions about protest is reducing young people's participation in it. There is, however, evidence that not discussing protest leaves young people less well equipped to critically evaluate their engagement with it. So, based on the findings from this research, there are a number of practice recommendations that could support youth work's potential to equip young people for political citizenship. Past citizenship education policy has tended to focus solely on formal education. My research demonstrates the role that informal opportunities, like those presented through youth work, play in supporting young people's socialisation. The first recommendation is that policy that supports the rollout of votes at 16 needs to recognise the vital role that youth work plays, particularly at reaching and engaging young people from marginalised and disadvantaged backgrounds who are less likely to engage in formal citizenship education and are less likely to vote. It's therefore vital that policy that supports the rollout of votes at 16 crosses sectors and crosses government departments. Knowledge about democratic systems and structures needs to be accompanied by opportunities for young people to take part and to feel like they are citizens if newly enfranchised young voters are going to feel sufficiently politically socialised to vote for the first time. And youth work is ideally placed to provide these opportunities. The second recommendation addresses the need for clarity about youth workers' remit to address political education, as there is currently a policy void around this. My research found that youth workers were unsure about the place of political education in practice, and an examination of youth work policy demonstrated that while citizenship is mentioned frequently, the role of political education is rarely directly addressed. Therefore, there's a need for clear national guidance, like the guidance that's available for schools that was written by the Department for Education in 2022, that outlines youth work's remit around political education. This could be developed at governmental level or at sector level, but it's vital if youth workers and funders are going to feel confident that these are areas that they should be engaging with. In addition to this, youth work organisations need to develop their own policies that clearly outline why, if, when, and how youth workers should address political issues. Developing clearer curricula that establish the approach that youth workers can take to discussions and activities that support political socialisation would be really beneficial. The third recommendation is that education, training and resources are needed to help develop youth workers' knowledge, skills and therefore their confidence around political socialisation. My research demonstrated that youth workers lacked confidence in their knowledge about political structures, which undermined their confidence to introduce or to develop political discussions. Supporting young people's political citizenship should be an element in all youth work education, from introduction to youth work training all the way through. There's also a need for continuing professional development package to be developed to help existing youth workers to feel confident to handle political discussions effectively. And there's a need for the development and dissemination of democratic education resources that are suitable for youth in youth work to support democratic education. Final recommendation is that democratic education needs to address protest. My research, as well as a range of other research, shows that young people draw on a broad range of dimensions to inform their understandings about political citizenship, and that currently youth workers and other educators appear to be very cautious about addressing some of these dimensions, particularly dimensions around protest. Limiting discussions about protest is not reducing young people's engagement with it, but it does reduce opportunities for them to critically evaluate their involvement. So currently approaches such as I Will encourage young people to take social action, but they overlook the political aspect of these. We need to give consideration to how we discuss protest with young people in a way that recognises that young people see protest as an important and accessible way that they can participate. Democratic education needs to equip young people with the knowledge and skills to consider their engagement with protest, exploring when protest can be effective and what the risks that can be associated with taking part. So if you're interested in finding any more about my work, there's a couple of links here that link to an article and to a policy brief, and there's my email address if you want to get in touch. I'm going to hand over now to Andy Mycock, who's going to draw on his knowledge about the rollout of votes at 16 to comment, and then we'll move on to Charlie Boucher, who will comment from a youth work perspective.
Thanks, Carole. Wow, Very rare you come to one of these online sessions and someone says they're going to do 20 minutes and they do 20 minutes on the nail. Congratulations. That's something I've never ever managed to realize. Um, it's really with great pride that Carol's invited me to speak. I was one of Carol's PhD supervisors, and she was not only a joy to supervise, but she also managed to do a PhD whilst tying down a full-time job and bring up a young family, a remarkable achievement in itself. But more than that, she produced a piece of work which filled a really significant evidence gap. It was a piece of innovative research, a lot of research around political socialization, about democratic engagement, has focused on what happens in schools and colleges, in formal education environments. Carole was one of the first people that I've seen to go and actually do a serious, significant piece of applied work, working not only with young people, but also with youth work practitioners. And that opened up a really interesting space to think about the challenges of votes at 16. And I think one of the things we can say is if we look back at the history of voting age reform, this relationship between what happens within formal education environments and what happens outside hasn't really been thought about. When the voting age was lowered to in 1969 to 18, there wasn't any real consideration about the idea of the socialization of young people, either politically or democratically at that point. And youth work sat outside of those formal conversations as there was a growing concern about the disengagement of young people with democracy. And it was noteworthy in 1998 when I first began some of my own research, and I knew Bernard Crick well, that the role of youth work wasn't really considered then either. So when you look back at the formation of the citizenship curriculum and its introduction into the national curriculum in 2002, there wasn't really a place for youth work. And it seemed that that kind of disconnected approach towards the experiences and the education of young people in different locations wasn't really thought about. And I think that's been a feature of the development of policy since then, is that in part that is understandable that government departments and the way in which policy is formed in school and non-school environments often has been disconnected in itself, but also that I think there's a sense in which there is a belief that what happens in schools was the most significant formative impact on that democratic and political socialization experience. And the research says that is not entirely accurate. It is quite clear that citizenship education in schools does have a powerful effect on many young people in schools, and that that has a lifelong effect as well. But there are a significant number of young people that go to school that don't enjoy being at school, do not academically succeed at school, and some even find very difficult in attending school. And that means that citizenship education in schools is not the panacea to democratic youth socialization. And what Carole's research highlights is that youth work is a very effective way of engaging with many of those young people that might not succeed academically at school and might not engage with citizenship as they do with other formal education academic subjects, and particularly those young people that may well not come from the kind of backgrounds where their parents are politically active, where their parents spend time investing in their socialization. It's clear that youth work has a powerful effect on many of those young people in connecting them with not only the idea that they are citizens at whatever age they are, but also that their voice matters and they have the right to engage and to be listened to and to be heard and responded by those people that make decisions in their life. I think in that, I think Carol's work really highlights two real areas of potential innovation as we look forward towards the lowering of the voting age at the next general election. I think it's clear that there is an impact of those programs that are delivered through youth work, social action programs, volunteering, and democratic voice and political agency programs, that there's a way in which we can start to think about how voting and engaging in politics is connected to a much broader framework of youth citizenship. And there is clearly an effect on those young people that get involved in social action and volunteering programs and other forms of youth democratic representation in the way in which that supplements what's happening in terms of what they learn in schools. In that, I think there is another potential opportunity in terms of that innovation, which is thinking about when and how these experiences happen, in what ways, what are the locations, and moving away from thinking that school is the only site of socialization, starting to map as young people transition from childhood through to early adulthood. What are those experiences, not only in school, but also in youth work environments, and also those experiences that are more informal? As Carole says, young people do undertake protest, and that form of protest they see as very much valid and outside of the formal political system. Many young people will not join a political party, but they may get involved in a protest that may well be linked to some form of youth work. And I think mapping these interventions and experiences on some form of what we've called a civic journey, where we can start to understand the collective and iterative effects of what happens in schools and in youth work environments, and also what happens in communities and the family home and online, and starting to get a better understanding about how these different interventions and experiences build together, I think will get us a better understanding of why young people vote or why young people might not vote. And then start to think about, well, what can we learn from that? And how can we develop an integrated program of interventions that means that we don't place all the responsibility on school teachers or on schools to be able to socialize young people, to be able to vote, whether the voting age is 16 or 18. So I think this is really important, Carole. Congratulations. I think that your policy brief is really very clear, and the fact that you've identified some easily translatable policy recommendations means that this is an important piece of work. But I shall pass on to Charlie, because Charlie is at the front line with much of this. She's working with young people on a daily basis, and she will have a very different view on this.
Thank you, Andy. I think the role of youth work in preparing young people for taking part in democratic processes, whether that's at votes at 16 or the current age of 18, is crucial. We have the opportunity to engage with young people in spaces that they choose, with trusted adults that they've chosen, and to explore conversations and discussions, topics that young people have chosen to have with us. They lead those conversations, and we should be engaging in them and not closing them down. I think Carole's research has highlighted that the muscle memory of the youth sector has diminished somewhat, and we've forgotten that youth work in its own essence, in its core principles, is political. We want to transfer power back to young people. We want to work with them in partnership. We want them to make decisions about their lives and what they do. Those are political motivations. And yet we seem to have lost that wider definition of politics and democracy to kind of think that we're only talking about a particular type of politics or a particular thing like party politics, when actually we're talking about where you buy your bread, where you shop, whether you choose fair trade, whether you don't. How you treat others in society is also political. So I think youth work needs to revisit what our understanding is of our core principles, and we certainly need to feel confident in having those conversations. And Carole, you highlighted that not every youth worker feels confident or able to engage in conversations they feel are risky. And I think that comes down to several years of lack of investment in the youth sector and the opportunities for people who are practicing to come together to have those conversations themselves, to test out how we feel about certain topics, and to think about how we can ask young people. We're not there to tell them what to think, we're there to make them think. So it's about asking the whys. And as a youth sector, we need to revisit that. So we need an appropriate trained workforce that's invested in and has the opportunity to engage with itself and then with young people to encourage them. The issues of protest and young people engaging in that, I think, is always difficult. I did actually recognize the young person on that quote. And I think for us, it's about how do we keep young people safer? How do we tell them to express themselves? And I find it interesting that we've tended to say to young people, oh, don't go to a protest, but actually we encourage other young people to go to pride marches, which started as a protest, started as a reclaiming, started as a celebration. Would I discourage a young person or a young woman from going to a Reclaim the Night march? Probably not, but I would have a conversation with them about how are they going to stay safe? How are they going to be with others? And that's the conversations that we need to have. We need to broaden out so that we're not seeing protests as a negative thing, but about reclaiming space and reclaiming our place in society. So I think, Carole, you've raised a huge amount of issues, and I think it's about how youth work in informal educational settings can complement what's happening in schools. They have a very set curriculum. They're limited on what they can discuss. They have limited time. The informal educational sector should have more time, shouldn't be limited on our topics. And we should also understand the legislation that we sit under. I think there's a fear from the BCS that the Charities Commission has said we can't engage in certain acts. But actually, what does that mean in principle? What does that mean in practice? Is education one of those acts? If it's not, then why aren't we doing it? So I think we need clearer structures, training, and indicator and guidance to encourage people to really go out there and have those conversations with young people and to feel confident in doing them. So thank you for raising the issues with this, because I think you've tapped on, identified, and kind of started a wider conversation amongst the youth sector. So thank you. Handing you back.
Some excellent presentations and responses. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining, and hope to see you again soon on a webinar with York St John.